Hey everybody, and welcome to another video by Scully. In today's video, I wanted to talk about something called catastrophizing. You may or may not have heard of this term before, but from my experience, I've found it to be pretty common. I just think people, a lot of times, they don't maybe know what it's called or think too much about it. It's just pretty automatic. But basically, catastrophizing, in a lot of scenarios, it's just kind of for lack of a better term, people would describe it as thinking of the worst possible thing that can happen in a situation. Most people use it as kind of like a coping mechanism. Like from my experience, I always thought it was pretty helpful when I was younger, because I thought, well, if I know the worst possible thing that could happen in a situation, and it doesn't seem so bad, well, then I'll stop worrying about it, right? Well, actually, no, not really. I think it was one of those things that I thought was helpful, and I'd done it for so long, I just kind of kept on doing it, and it still happens sometimes, and I have to kind of snap myself out of it. But that's why I wanted to bring up this topic, because like I said, I do think it's kind of more common than people realize. So yeah, catastrophizing. Especially within this past year, I'm sure a lot of people have probably thought about it as well, since a lot of things were going on. So basically, with catastrophizing, a pretty good example might be, like a lot of us probably, whether it was in college or just even in school when we were younger, projects, assignments were really pretty common. None of us really a stranger to that to some extent. So yeah, like let's say you have a really big test you had to study for. You might think, okay, well, the worst possible thing that could happen is, you know, maybe you fail the test and then you fail the course. Well, no big thing, right? Well, not really. I mean, in college, that's kind of a bigger deal. I mean, failing a course in college can feel a lot more overwhelming than probably in school, and even in school too, because getting good grades are important, turning in assignments. That stuff's pretty big deal. You don't want to take it too lightly. So, I mean, I could see that being a topic that if you were like in elementary school, that probably, like, okay, if you're worried about that test, maybe that wasn't as big of a deal if you were a lot younger, and maybe it was like a spelling test that, like, if you're really good at spelling, yeah, you don't really have to worry about it too much because you're really good at that. Well, get up to like college level stuff, it's very, very hard, and there's a lot more pressure. It's all very hard, really, but yeah, things are kind of different when you get older. But yeah, so you're really worried about studying for this test, and at first you kind of maybe go to that little mechanism because it's helped you in the past. Well, you kind of start thinking about it and thinking, well, that's the worst possible thing that can happen. But then maybe it quickly turns into, you know, like if you have to retake the course again, or if you're already in like a college program, and if you're worried about flunking out of that too, well, this mechanism suddenly isn't so helpful anymore, because not only are you thinking about the worst possible thing, and it's really kind of, you know, escalating more than you thought it would, but it's actually making your stress worse. And then your anxiety is getting worse, and if you're somebody who's prone to things like that, and especially depression, one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you just feel pretty cruddy about the situation altogether. Like, even if you've studied so hard for this test, and you know everything, you're kind of walking into it with a bad attitude now because of all of this. So yeah, you apply that to enough situations, you kind of start to realize why this mechanism isn't so effective anymore. Okay, so you don't want to catastrophize anymore because you realize it's not very effective. So, what are you supposed to do instead of catastrophizing that's more constructive? Okay, well, instead of thinking of the worst possible thing, kind of have a plan set out in front of you, like studying for a test. If you know how much time you're going to spend studying for that test every single day, or, like if you have like a couple weeks or whatnot before the test, coming up with a schedule and a plan for that in itself is already very helpful. Okay, so you've got that part down. Well, what about your overall outlook about the situation? Well, if you studied enough for the test, hopefully at least part of that anxiety will kind of start to go away because you're very confident in your ability to do that. But what about, again, just your overall attitude about going in to take that test? Because you don't want to go in with a bad attitude, right? Basically, you can allow yourself some time to worry about these kind of things, but you don't want to let it control your life. Because although it's important, you don't want to overwhelm yourself with stress, because then you might also just affect your performance in that matter as well. So basically, instead of thinking of the worst possible thing that can possibly happen in that situation, kind of just focus more on the task at hand. Like, instead of worrying about, oh, if I fail this test, then this will happen, and then this will happen, kind of get in the habit of just pushing that out of the way and telling yourself, like, okay, well, we're not worried about that part right now because that part hasn't happened yet. As hard as it can be to kind of limit how much you worry, once you kind of start to kind of make that a habit, it becomes a lot easier. Because as being a futuristic person as I am, I found that very difficult. I always was thinking, well, what's next? Well, what's next? So as I've gotten older, I have had to kind of really minimize the, again, failing the test kind of extreme scenario in this example, instead of fixating on the failure part of it and what happens next. Kind of trying to remind myself, like, okay, well, that hasn't happened yet. And again, wanting control over things is very important for obvious reasons, but really kind of getting in the habit of, like, okay, that hasn't happened yet, so we're not going to think about that yet because it hasn't happened yet. We're just going to focus on, okay, I'm going in to take that test. I've studied for it. I've done really everything I can. I've gotten a good night's sleep. We're going to focus on taking this test first. So then really kind of telling myself, like, okay, well, we're just going to worry about getting that part done first. And then, of course, the really horrible part of waiting what the result on your test is, and then telling myself, okay, well, we've taken the test, we've completed that, it's out of our hands right now, until we get the results back. And that can be the very nerve-wracking part, because that determines what happens next. But when you kind of shift your focus over to the things that you can control, and the things that you can worry about, and really just kind of focusing on that little portion, suddenly things don't seem as overwhelming anymore. Of course, this sounds super easy. This isn't something that people learn to do overnight. But sometimes really kind of realizing that what you're focusing on in terms of what your anxiety and your worry is about, and how much of that you actually have control over, that really kind of dawns on you how much of it you're worried about. Like, okay, if you only have control over, like, let's say maybe 60% of that situation, including the test, studying, and all that stuff, and then the other maybe 40% is, like, let's say everything else after that, like the result and everything, that's actually quite a bit to worry about, considering if you only have control over that 60%. And of course that's an imaginary number, but when you start to realize how much of it you're worried about and how you only have control over so much of it, it becomes pretty apparent as to why you can stress yourself out pretty quickly over the part of it that you don't have control over. And again, that is something that takes time, because when you have habits like catastrophizing that you've been doing for so long in your life and thinking, hey, this is pretty helpful, it can take some time to kind of take a step back and really look at it and think, well, that's not helpful at all. I really got to try something else. So then that's when you can get yourself into the habit of, like, okay, like, if you're somebody who wants to have control, anxiety is usually all about control. So if you start realizing how much of it you have control over and how much of it you really don't, hopefully over time you can use that to kind of take a whole bunch of worry and kind of try to gradually bring it down. And it is something that takes a lot of time, but then once you're able to do that, you really will feel a lot better. And know that unfortunately life has quite a bit of things that aren't always in our control, but that's not always a bad thing, because not only is it overall less for you to worry about in general, but that's just also just part of what makes life great anyway, because if you could control every single aspect of your life, I mean, a lot of things would seem pretty pointless after a while. So the parts of it that are random, that are spontaneous, are actually very beautiful. It just depends on how they happen. It's like, hey, when it works out for the best, it's great. When it doesn't, well, yeah, that part's not great. but the ups and downs in life like that really can kind of show us that even though they're not always fun, life kind of having surprises for you can be a good thing. And we learn to appreciate that over time. I mean, you want to make your life great, but you want to enjoy the parts of it that are just kind of unexpected too. Because even if they're a surprise at first that doesn't feel all that great, maybe they can kind of work out for the best later on. So, yeah, with catastrophizing, especially, you want to focus on more than just the negatives in life. Because although negative and positive things will always exist in life, well, it's not just negatives all the time. There's positives as well. And when you think of the worst possible thing all the time, I mean, maybe sometimes thinking of the worst possible thing can, in theory, make you feel better, but that's not, like in the example I stated before, that's kind of to show you, like, how over time that mechanism can really kind of work against you. And that also shifts your focus back to worrying about everything rather than just the parts you have control over. So just kind of learn to be patient with yourself and realize that there are better things to focus on than just the negative things. And just when you least expect it, things can work out. Like if you are studying all night for a test, sometimes things don't work out, and sometimes you don't always end up passing the test. But the other part of it that can make it easier as well is realizing that failure it's a sad part of life, but it is part of life. Sometimes you can control certain areas of it, and sometimes it just kind of happens, and it happens for a reason. And through that, you get better, you sharpen your skills, you get up and try again, and you realize that it is temporary. And one of the many things in life that's great is that sometimes you can, like, fail a class and take it again, and you wonder why maybe you didn't pass it the first time. Well, maybe there's more that you learned from that class than just algebra or spelling or whatever that class was about. Maybe there were some character building skills that you were supposed to learn as well, some organization skills, or just simply learning patience. And life has many surprises like that, and sometimes you don't always realize it. So sometimes things can be more than what they appear. So if you're having a hard time, especially with things like school, especially during all this pandemic stuff, try to be patient with yourself and realize that situations can have more to offer than what they appear. And just keep trying, because you'll get it. Have a safe night, everybody.